Hi, this is Shambhavi. Welcome to my weekly podcast about spirituality, love, death, devotion, and waking up while living in a messy world. The Satsang with Shambhavi podcast is recorded live each week with students of our nonprofit community, Jayakula. For more information and to find out about attending a satsang, visit jayakula.org. Thanks for listening. Much love to you, wherever and however you are. There is a feeling and a movement and an energy of care and compassion that is just filling this entire reality. And we get distanced from that. We get separated from awareness of that through the natural production of this appearing of all of us individuals. So as we appear as individuals, we appear with various limitations. And the root limitation, according to this tradition anyway, is our feeling of separation. We feel separate from each other. We feel separate from things. Like, for instance, you might feel separate from a cup that you're drinking out of. Some feelings of separation aren't painful, but some are. And we feel separate from God, even if we don't call it God. We feel all these various forms of separation are all because we came in naturally formed in such a way that we have some limitations in our ability to connect with awareness to the natural state. And also built into us, in addition to these limitations or these apparent limitations, also built into us is the desire to escape from these limitations. And people try to do that in various ways, successful and unsuccessful. So, for instance, when we feel like we want to heal or escape a feeling of separation, one thing we might do is actually hole up in a tiny little community or a tiny little family or a tiny little nation and try to form a cohesive family or community or society that perceives everything else to be an enemy. So one way of trying to heal separation that is really very unsuccessful is to set boundaries between yourself in a group and all others, and then have that group be somehow groomed to enact a fake feeling of unity through various enforced norms and concepts that people hold in common. And anything that disagrees with that gets ejected. So this is the basic engine of fascism, is to have one group that's superior and better, that forms these very strong boundaries and then goes after everybody else, right? And tries to impose all these norms on everybody in the group. And we might think of that as just evil or something, but actually it's also an attempt to reconnect in some way, to find some sense of unity or connection. And now on the other end of the spectrum is when we encounter a spiritual tradition that tells us that we're already connected to and continuous with the whole of life, and that gives us some tools to rediscover that. But the most important thing to understand is that in addition to not being able to participate in the natural flow of caring and compassion because we feel separate. In addition to that, what is also built in is this desire to discover that again. We can do that in ways that are healthy, and we can do that in ways that reinforce limitation, but they have the same motivation. So built into us is this yearning to rediscover this compassion and caring that's everywhere, connection. In Shaivism, it's called the heart. To rediscover the heart is a desire that is built into everyone naturally, and it just gets expressed in these ridiculously various ways. When we encounter non-caring, we can also ask ourselves to look at the ways that people are still trying to connect, even though they can't really get in touch with their hearts very well. That's one way of entering back into compassion for people, is to understand that they're trying to connect and get to the same place you're trying to get to, but with much more limited tools and limited clarity. So there's nobody that needs to be vilified because we're all being motivated by the same desire. And ultimately, the base state of reality, like what is reality made of? It is made of this living wisdom. And I know that doesn't mean a lot to many of you, but it is absolutely something that you can encounter and know for yourself eventually. And so even though we have a lot of limitation being expressed here in the human realm, wisdom is victorious. Wisdom is victorious. And it is always sitting prior to any limitations that might be being expressed. It's also why destruction is such an engine of reconnection with wisdom. Because once you destroy so much, you get to what's left. And what's left is wisdom. What's left is how things actually are. We can hide out in our limitations for a very long time. We're very comfortable with them. Most people really like their limitations on some level. And a lot of people don't have confidence in the fact that there's anything else to rely on. So we need to learn that. We need to be shown that. We're shown it every day in many ways, but we aren't trained to look at it or give it much importance. One of my jobs is to just get people to value the ways in which wisdom is already revealing itself to you, that you've just been trained to discount or look away from. So remember that when we're looking at uncaring people or uncaring communities, we can also look at the ways that those communities are trying to connect in some way, even though they don't have the right tools and they're doing it in a very limited way. It doesn't mean we have to stick around and endure that, but we can develop more compassion when we know for sure that everyone is motivated by the same thing we're motivated by, no matter how limited other people seem. The minute we start to feel superior, we're doing it better than other people. The minute we start to feel that, we're already back in our limitations. It is true that some beings are more limited and some beings are less limited. But that's just how we were made by this alive, aware reality. It's nothing for you to take personal pride in. You didn't cause that situation. So the minute we sit around and feel spiritually superior or socially or culturally superior or something like that, we've already lost our ground that we were standing on. It's kind of silly.
Could you define wisdom when you're using that word? What do you mean by wisdom?
Yes, I can't define it in a way that would satisfy you. I can tell you what my experience of it is. Wisdom, first of all, is not truth. It's not some ultimate conception of reality that we arrive at and then can, spout in an elevator speech or something. My experience of this, first of all, is that everything is alive and self-aware. So when I say wisdom, I mean the wisdom/virtues of an alive, aware reality, an alive, self-aware reality, where self-awareness permeates or is the ground of everything. So what I've encountered is an intelligence so sparkling with clarity that it's painful to encounter it at first. I've encountered it as just oceans of compassion and mercy and sweetness and also playfulness and humor. And I've encountered it as the most all-encompassing devotion. This is something that was part of what was revealed to me during sadhana. It's not something that I read in a book. So this idea that this is what reality is actually made of, it's actually the stuff of existence, was a direct understanding that came to me experientially and had not been anything I'd been taught particularly. It just was an overwhelming revelation. And later, you can read hints of this in books, Buddhist teachers in particular talking about wisdom being the fundament of reality. But I've never heard anybody talk about it in this kind of concrete way, or experientially concrete way anyway. I've tried over the years to describe it like this. So what I call it is wisdom hyphen virtue, because it is what is talked about as the essential goodness or sweetness of all of reality. In both Dzogchen and Trika, it's kind of an animist perspective where everything is alive and self-aware. That's a word that I think is a good word, even though it's not a word used by these traditions themselves. I think it's like it's another entry point for people who are struggling to understand this a little bit. I've tried to find words to just point toward this over the years, but one of the ways in which the traditions I'm in already embody this view is in personifying all of reality. So both Dzogchen and Trika and Hinduism in general personify reality. In other words, they conceive of reality as a being, a sort of super being. And different traditions in India and different traditions in Tibet have different personifications of this reality, although I don't think any of them would say that their personification is the only personification that's possible. I think they all have the understanding that the personification of reality is because reality is like a person. All of reality is like a person. Or we could say we are people because all of reality is like a person. We are reflecting the nature of reality, the nature of the reality that popped us out. We are reflections of that all-encompassing self. In Dzogchen, this all-encompassing self is called Samantabhadra. There are actually paintings of Samantabhadra. And Samantabhadra means the all-good. The all-good. And then, of course, in our tradition, it's Lord Shiva. But in some other Hindu traditions, it's some form of Shakti, or it's Vishnu, or it's Ganesha, or some other being, the Mahadevas. But one of the names of Lord Shiva is also the Beneficent. So Lord Shiva and Samantabhadra are pretty much the same, that all of reality has this quality of goodness. Goodness without an opposite, goodness without badness, goodness without evil. And that is what you know when you encounter this in a more full-on way. Now, people who are hearing these teachings and who haven't done a lot of practice, or maybe you have done a lot of practice, but just given your configuration, you haven't encountered this yet. This is a very difficult thing. It's an impossible thing to understand intellectually. It's just not possible. There are ways that you could feel the reality of it just as kind of a heart feeling, but that's not the same as fully encountering it. So there's going to be doubt about this kind of teaching, and that's natural and normal. And if any of you who hadn't really encountered this more fully for yourself came to me and started spouting these kinds of teachings and professing your great confidence in them without having actually had this experience, I don't want you to do that. This is a find out for yourself tradition. This isn't a believe me teaching tradition. This isn't impress the teacher with how well you mouth the spiritual teachings tradition. You won't impress me that way, believe me. At best, you will get a neutral response from me. That's the very best that you'll get out of me. But we do have more inklings of this than we know, than we're aware of. Because it is our real nature. This is who we really are. We really are this wisdom virtue. We really are this being. We really are the fullness of this reality. That is what we call our real nature, our real self. We already are that. And we just have some things in the way of us perceiving that more fully. But they're not totally in the way. We just have been trained not to put much stock when we do encounter this feeling or this perception. So it's very difficult to have full confidence in this. And that just takes time. Once we have recognized this, even a little bit, then we continue to practice for years and years until we have more full confidence in it. So it's perfectly natural to be doubtful about this. Absolutely. That's a real thing. Until we aren't doubtful, until we no longer can doubt. And as they say in Zen traditions, I think it's a beautiful teaching. Great doubt brings great realization. And without great doubt, there could be no great realization. Because if you don't have great doubt, that just means you've surrendered your own clarity and said, I just believe this or I don't believe it. Either way is bullshit. So understand that your doubts are fine. They're just fine. And they're helpful, actually. Because eventually you'll have more of an experience of this through daily practice and through being with the teacher and whatever other things happen to you just by grace, that you won't be able to doubt anymore. It won't be possible anymore. Because reality will have announced itself to you so loudly and thoroughly that despite your objections, you won't be able to hold up under the onslaught of the reality of how things actually are. Swami Lakshmanji said that this kind of teaching is a bitter pill because it implies that it is true that everything that's happening here is not happening the way we think it is. So, of course, the main objection to this kind of teaching, and the idea that everything is made of this goodness and this wisdom, is what about all the suffering in the world? You're kidding me, right? Or you must be some new agey twit or something that you're you're giving this kind of teaching. And I very much hesitate to give this kind of teaching in public because people do have that reaction. And actually, I guess that's better than some other kinds of reactions. But, you know, we have teachings that are not very often given in public, but they're there and you can find them in both Trika and in the Buddhist traditions. And what they tell us is that none of this is actually happening the way we think it is. Everything here is made of that primordial wisdom. It's not made of people and things. This display in Dzogchen is called a magical display or an ornament of the natural state, like jewelry or cosplaying of the natural state. Everything that we experience, all worlds and beings and circumstances. In Trika is referred to as the glamour of the natural state. Glamour meaning beautiful, but also magical, like in the old school meaning of glamour, to glamorize somebody. If you've heard that use of the word. So this is a bitter pill because we're very invested in everything here being all real and struggly. But this is the real teaching, not the baby teaching. And again, it's not something you can just understand intellectually. It's not possible. But you can hear it and feel the truth of it kind of ringing in you, even if you don't understand it. This kind of tradition is said to be for people who are mature practitioners. And that could mean many things, right? It could mean you were practicing in other lives. But what it means is that you're prepared in some way. You're prepared to entertain the more thorough and difficult view of a tradition like this. And that means if you're really suited for this kind of tradition, you do feel that sense of yes, even if you have no idea what is being said on a more intellectual level. And that certainly was my experience. When I very first encountered this particular tradition, Trika, it was through a book. And it was a very scholarly book. And it had a lot of Sanskrit words in it that I didn't know at the time. It was basically an academic tome. I probably only understood 10% of it at the time. But the hairs on my arm were literally standing up. I was so electrified by the 10% that I understood. So it's beautiful that we have so many opportunities to have our real nature announced to us in so many different ways. As long as we're being sensitive and we value that. We have to value those moments in order for them to become vehicles for more realization. One of the things that can get in the way is skepticism. Skepticism is just a stance. It's not the same as doubt. Doubt is a very honest and open way to be. But skepticism is just another stance. and it blocks things from getting in. Another thing that is very present in our culture is that we're taught to just trust our own experience. People say, well, that's just an experience. I mean, what do you mean by that, actually? Think about that. Do you really have anything other than experience? I mean, your experience of intellectual things is also an experience. You don't actually have anything else. And as a matter of fact, you, yourself, are an experience of God. You're God's experience. So this devaluation of experience is very impoverishing. We need to start revaluing our experience. Stop devaluing it. Satsang with Shambhavi is produced by Jayakula, a nonprofit community offering opportunities to learn and practice in the direct realization traditions of Trika Shaivism and Dzogchen. If you enjoyed listening, please help us keep this podcast and many other teachings open to all by making a monthly or one-time donation. Visit jayakula.org to make a donation and explore more of our offerings.